The greatest discovery of my generation is that human beings can alter their lives by altering their attitudes. Welcome to the first episode of this series on anxiety. In this first episode, we look at anxiety from the perspective of psychology and philosophy. Anxiety is incredibly fascinating because it's something that we all share. Some of you listening may well be experiencing it right now, but this universal experience is also incredibly unique, which is why I'll try my best here to speak to the individual. In doing so, I'll be exploring how ancient philosophies and modern psychological theories converge and diverge in their understanding of anxiety. From the Stoics, who saw anxiety as a challenge to be met with reason and virtue, to the rationalists, who felt the remedy lay in the acquisition of knowledge, to existentialists who regarded it as a fundamental aspect of being human, the dizziness of freedom. And then the psychological theories of state or trait anxiety, how anxiety is related to the sense of purpose, subconscious elements, cognitive aspects, or even learned behaviours. My hope is that I'll leave you with both solace and insight that will help you navigate through not just your own emotional landscape, but also better understand those around you, an understanding that will no doubt lend to being a better son, daughter, partner, parent, or even friend. Firstly, clearly conceptualising anxiety is essential because for most of us, when we think of anxiety, a large spectrum of states come to mind. That's because it's fair to say that when thinking of anxiety, most of us also incorporate other distinct but similar states into our understanding of it. The most common parallels that loosely resemble the state of anxiety are fear and stress. Fear, anxiety, and stress often coexist and are even sometimes dependent on one another. But it's crucial when formally addressing each state to appreciate and highlight the distinct differences between these terms. So stress is a physiological response to perceived challenges or threats, characterised by acute and chronic forms. It initiates a complex bodily reaction, primarily governed by the autonomic nervous system. The word autonomous refers to the fact that it's self-governing, so this system has everything to do with controlling our involuntary responses without conscious effort. In the context of stress, the autonomic nervous system orchestrates an adaptive response, mobilising the body's resources to meet the demands of the perceived threat. While stress manifests itself in psychological symptoms and is influenced by individual perception and coping mechanisms, its essence lies in its physiological effects on the body. The autonomic nervous system plays a central role in these effects, underscoring stress as a primarily physiological phenomenon, albeit one that may have significant psychological implications. And one of those is fear. Now, fear can be best described by the reaction to a specific danger in which an individual can make a specific adjustment. Fears can be rational, for which there will be many examples, or irrational. Let's take the example of the obsessive compulsive. The fears are irrational, the obsessions, and the specific adjustments are clearly disproportionate, the compulsions. Either way, fear is the reaction that comes following the perception of an imminent threat to the individual, however rational or irrational, which arises in their external environment, or in specific cases, such as the psychotic or obsessive disorders, their mind. Anxiety can be best defined by psychologist Rollo May, in which he defined anxiety as, quote, the apprehension cued off by a threat to some value that an individual holds essential to his existence as a personality. This is a brilliant definition because it's so specific, but I appreciate it's not imminently clear to understand, so let's clarify it. In a sense, what May is stating is where fear is the response to a specific threat arising in the individual's environment, anxiety is the response to a perceived threat to the individual's identity. Let's describe the initial part to its definition, that is, the apprehension cued off by a threat. In more commonly used language, this can be simply translated to the state of worry which is prompted by a threat. Think of it like dominoes in a way. With anxiety, the threat is only relevant at the start. That is, the perceived threat is what starts off the chain reaction of anxious thoughts and emotions and general state of heightened arousal, but after initially prompting the state, the initial threat is largely irrelevant in maintaining the state of anxiety. Unlike fear, which goes away when the perceived threat does, the state of anxiety remains regardless of whether the initial threat that prompted it has faded away in relevance. So that's the first part to the definition. Now the second part, threat to some value that an individual holds essential to his existence. Now this part really gets to the essence of what anxiety is, its source. Our internal landscape, our conscious, subconscious, or even deeper primitive drives. Well, it's incredibly complicated for all of us, without exception. Trying to define, clarify, and process these subconscious complexes, conflicts, drives, values, insecurities, and so on, Well, it's no easy feat, and the job is never fully complete. In short, our complex internal landscape is murky, even at times of stability, let alone in the emotionally aroused state of anxiety. So it's not entirely clear what inside of us feels threatened during these periods of anxiety, which is why anxiety is often so vague, with no clearly identified thing which is causing it. To further help distinguish between fear and anxiety, let's consider two concrete examples. One exemplifies fear in its most elemental form, while the other showcases how what is often interpreted as fear might more accurately be described as anxiety. This distinction is crucial for the sole reason that, well, if wanting to overcome these states, we first need to identify exactly what they are. So first, imagine you're on holiday and decide to go for a swim. You venture out slightly further than usual, turn your head and suddenly encounter a shark. This scenario provokes fear, not so much from a calculated concern for physical harm, although this could add to it, but through an instinctual reaction to the situation itself. This instinctual fear isn't reliant on and does not require the individual to rationalize the potential consequences of the encounter. The fear response is immediate and visceral. It's here where Carl Jung's explorations into archetypes becomes incredibly interesting. However, the focus here is on the instinctual aspect of fear, an unmediated response that does not necessitate conscious deliberation over the dangers presented by the shark, although they may too be present. This highlights fear in its most primal form, an automatic, hardwired reflex aimed at mobilizing the body to either avoid or face specific threats. Let's move on to the second scenario, the fear of rejection. Here we encounter a situation often misinterpreted as fear, but is more accurately described as anxiety. This scenario seems to present a direct, identifiable threat, rejection by others, whether in romantic, social, or professional contexts. Yet a deeper inspection actually reveals that the core concern is not the rejection itself, but the anticipated emotional fallout. The apprehension of feeling inadequate, lonely, ashamed, or unworthy after being rejected characterizes this response as anxiety. It's the anticipation of negative emotional states and the psychological distress they entail, rather than a specific identifiable danger to avoid, that defines this experience. So taking you back to the initial definition of anxiety, the apprehension cued off by a threat to some value that an individual holds essential to his existence as a personality. With anxiety, the barrage of attacks are on a deeper level. The threats are to things that lie at the core, the essence of our personality. Whatever these things are being threatened, what is always true is that it's within the internal landscape of the individual, and what's being attacked is seen to be essential to one's existence and security as a personality. And when I say existence here, it can be, but rarely is, referring to physical existence, i.e. the threat of death, but more often, psychological existence. That is, threat of meaninglessness, loss of freedom, or the loss of value we deem ourselves to have in a particular area of life. And take the example of someone who links self-worth to job performance. Either way, this is the crux of why anxiety can feel so unpleasant. It triggers this cliched fight or flight response, but you can't flee from what's within you, and you can't fight what you don't know. Anxiety is parasitic in this sense, in that it lives inside and feeds off the individual. However uncomfortable a fear may be, it's experienced as a threat that is separate from you, arising in the environment, and to which an adjustment can, at least in theory, be made. The relation of the individual to a given object is what's important, and if that object can be removed or avoided, the worry disappears. But since anxiety attacks the core components of the personality, the individual can't stand outside the threat, and so is powerless either to avoid or confront it. The individual is afraid, but unsure what exactly they're afraid of. And this is why it's also very difficult to appreciate from the outside what a person in severe anxiety is experiencing. It can be likened in this sense to pleading the drowning man to swim, but being completely unaware that under the water his hands and feet are tied. Taken directly from Rollo May's book, The Meaning of Anxiety, is the following excerpt. If, however, one cannot cope with the dangers in their specific forms, one will be threatened on the deeper level, which we call the core or essence of personality. Using a military analogy, battles on various segments of the front lines represent specific threats. So long as the battle can be fought out on the periphery, so long as the dangers can be warded off in the area of the outer fortifications, the vital areas are not threatened. But when the enemy breaks through into the capital of the country, when the inner lines of communication are broken and the battle is no longer localized, when, that is, the enemy attacks from all directions and the defending soldiers do not know which way to march or where to take a stand, we have the threat of being overwhelmed, with its corollaries, panic and frantic behaviour. The latter is analogous to a threat to the basic values, the inner citadel of the personality, and in individual psychological terms, it is the threat responded to as anxiety. Thus, figuratively speaking, we may describe fear as the armour against anxiety. Now, the reason inquiry into anxiety is largely philosophical in nature reflects the fact that, like fear, anxiety too is a completely normal experience shared by all human beings. The sentiment generally agreed on is that the capacity to experience anxiety is shared amongst all humans. It's innate. We're born with it. It becomes abnormal then, not purely because it's present, but instead the quality and quantity of anxiety experienced. Conceptually, it's helpful to describe anxiety that is maladaptive as the state in which our internal experience does not match with our external environment. That is, the perceived concern we feel subjectively does not align with the relative order in our environment. Using this same notion, for those of you listening, think back to a period in which you can recall experiencing a distinct sense of anxiety. If you would describe yourself as generally anxious and yet struggle to either point to a discrete event, or even that you have an example yet struggle to identify what prompted the anxiety in the first place, or even that you struggle to describe the specific thoughts which occupied your mind during the episode which ultimately served to maintain this state of worry, well, this is generally a good indicator that the anxiety you are experiencing is in fact abnormal. Often with increasingly severe cases of anxiety, the threat which may have prompted the state, as well as the discrete thoughts which arise during it, cannot be clearly identified, and instead it's just this state of heightened but pervasive worry, dread, or even restlessness that seems detached from logic or explanation. So we've done a fair bit of exploration into the nature of anxiety. I'm now going to specify the notable contributions specific schools of psychology and philosophy have offered towards our understanding and management of it. I'm going to first touch on the cognitive and behavioural perspectives. I'll be weaving into this the concept of state and trait, and then we'll go to the Stoics for their practical advice and wisdom. Cognitive psychology highlights the intricacies of thought on anxiety, emphasising how maladaptive cognitions shape our emotional landscape. This perspective intricately details the mechanisms through which thoughts, often automatic, distorted, and deeply ingrained, construct the scaffolding of anxiety. You may have heard before the notion of state and trait in psychology, state being a way of describing temporary characteristics at a specific time, and trait being a more enduring, stable set of characteristics that the individual demonstrates over longer periods of time. Cognitive distortions can amplify both state and trait anxiety, but manifest differently. State anxiety, being transient, might see distortions as situational, exaggerated responses to immediate stresses, where catastrophic thinking or overgeneralization inflates the perceived threat. These are examples in cognitive psychology of automatic thoughts, surface-level assumptions driving the state. Now, trait anxiety reflects a more chronic cognitive stance, where pervasive negative thinking patterns about oneself and the world contribute to a stable disposition towards anxiety across varying contexts. These are referred to in this context as core beliefs that the individual holds. Advanced cognitive therapies will delve into these patterns with precision, employing techniques like cognitive restructuring to dissect and reconstruct the complex web of thoughts underlying anxiety. This process is necessarily nuanced, considering the individual's unique cognitive landscape, historical conditioning, and the subtle distinctions between their experiences of state and trait anxiety. A competent professional will work to untangle the threads of thought that bind the individuals to their anxious states, promoting a deeper cognitive flexibility and resilience. Now, behavioural psychology offers a complementary perspective, which is why it's often combined, forming the application of CBT. Behavioural components focus on how anxiety is learned and maintained through behaviour. This view dives into the conditioning processes underlying anxiety, drawing on how certain responses are reinforced or eradicated over time. It's very useful when considering the role of avoidance. Particularly with trait anxiety, behavioural patterns like avoidance become deeply ingrained habits that perpetuate a cycle of anxiety. Here, the behaviour itself, avoiding feared situations, strengthens the trait anxiety by preventing corrective experiences. You can liken anxiety in this situation to the fear of fear. Now, behavioural interventions target these patterns directly, gradually exposing individuals to feared stimuli in a controlled manner to relearn responses. And so combining both the behavioural components and cognitive aspects in the making of CBT, I find it helpful to conceptualise it as the following. Cognitive therapy, well, when done right, by doing the necessary digging, turns what was a vague, persistent anxiety into discrete, identifiable fears. The individual is now presented with clear targets in which to aim at. The behavioural component then gets to work. By leveraging the conditioning processes against that which one fears, well, it turns those fears into freedom. And in some sense, this sentiment aligns with the Stoic practice of negative visualization, the judicious practice of deliberate contemplation of worst-case scenarios. It's the facing of feared scenarios which will ultimately lead to the acclimatization of them. Well, this was a sentiment shared 2,000 years ago. So let's briefly turn to Stoicism now before wrapping it up. As I was explaining the relationship between anxiety and fear, it wasn't the existentialists that came to mind, but instead the Stoics. Echoes of Seneca in one of his famous letters, where he famously stated, "There are more things likely to frighten us than there are to crush us. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." And Epictetus, widely acknowledged to be the inspiration for cognitive psychology, who famously stated, "It is not events that disturb people, it is their judgments concerning them." Stoicism, with all its wisdom, provides us with a certain philosophical depth in coping with anxiety, famed for its emphasis on distinguishing between what we can and can't control, as well as the focus on actions and attitudes. Embodying the essence of these teachings is fundamental, if not for, in my view, one major reason. That is a key component which serves to halt any anxious state is agency. You see, anxiety feeds off these false delusions of loss of control. But constructive movement, however small, will immediately loosen anxiety's grip. And why is that? Well, it's because the trajectory towards where we want to be, and not our proximity to it, is what truly matters. Because anxiety relies on our immobility to install our sense of vulnerability. I think that wraps it up nicely. I'll finish off looking at anxiety from a psychological and philosophical perspective next time, where we look at existential schools, the philosophy of rationalism, and maybe turn to Eastern philosophies for some insight. As always, I hope this helped, and thank you again for listening.